The contractor I recommended for 6 years was installing inferior materials and charging for premium ones. I found out when a client called about moisture in a new wall. What I found affected everything I had professionally built. There are professional mistakes that are your own, that come from a decision you made or something you did not verify or a judgment that turned out to be wrong. And there is harm that arrives from outside, that someone else produces, that nevertheless has your name on the contract. That affects people who trusted you and not the contractor you recommended. That distinction matters for understanding what happened. But it does not change the fact that when a client calls to report a problem in a new home, the architect who signed the project is the one who receives the call, and who has the responsibility to understand what happened before explaining it to her. My name is Daniel. I am 47 years old. I am an architect with independent practice, and I have spent 18 years working primarily on residential projects in Mexico City and the metropolitan area. The contractor's name was Felipe. He was 51 years old. He was a master builder with his own small construction company. We had worked together on 12 projects over 6 years. 12 projects where I had recommended him to my clients with the confidence of someone who has seen another person's work enough times to consider them reliable. The client who called was named Fernanda. She was 43 years old. She was a businesswoman. She had contracted the complete renovation project for her house 18 months ago. The work had finished 4 months ago, and 4 months after finishing, there was moisture in the north wall of the study. The wall that, according to the project specifications, had a high-performance thermal insulation system that cost approximately 4 times more than standard insulation. Fernanda called me with the calm of someone who trusts there is an explanation, but who needs that explanation before continuing to trust. She described the moisture. She told me which part of the wall. She told me she had called an engineer independently to tell her what might be happening. That the engineer had told her the moisture suggested the insulation in that wall did not have the thermal properties it should have if it were the specified system. I told her I was going to come see it that same day. I went that afternoon. The moisture was visible, not devastating, but visible and in a place that should not have that problem if the insulation was as specified. I asked Fernanda permission to open a small section of the wall to verify what was inside. She agreed. What I found when we opened, it was not the high-performance thermal insulation system that was in the project specifications. It was standard insulation that cost approximately a quarter as much, that did not have the thermal properties of the specified system, and that completely explained the moisture Fernanda was seeing. I stood in front of that open wall for a moment, not processing whether or not it was what I thought. It was exactly what I thought, processing the extent of what I was seeing. One project, my project, with my signature, with my recommendation of the contractor, with materials that did not correspond to those specified, paid for as if they corresponded. I told Fernanda that what we had found confirmed what the engineer had suggested, that the installed insulation was not the one specified in the project, that was a breach of contract that required correction at the expense of whoever had committed it. That I was going to talk to Felipe that afternoon, and that the following day I would have an explanation and an action plan for her. Fernanda listened. She told me she appreciated the clarity, that she hoped the correction process would be as clear as the explanation. I called Felipe on the way to my studio. I did not get to the accusation part immediately. I started by asking him whether he remembered Fernanda's project. He told me yes. I asked him what insulation system he had installed in the north wall of the study. He took a while. He told me there had been a problem with the availability of the specified system at that time, that he had had to use an alternative. I asked him whether he had told me at the time. Silence. He told me he had not wanted to generate a delay in the work. I told him that afternoon we had opened the wall, that what he had installed was not an equivalent alternative. It was a standard system at a quarter of the cost of the specified one. That in the project account statement, he had charged the price of the premium system. Longer silence. Felipe told me we could talk, that he wanted to explain to me what had happened. We met the following day at my studio. Felipe arrived with the tension of someone who knows the conversation coming is of a specific kind. What he told me over the following hour, I listened to with the attention of someone who needs all the information before determining the steps that follow. He told me Fernanda's project had not been the first. He told me there had been moments in other projects where he had made similar substitutions. Not always of the same magnitude, not always in the same materials, but the pattern was the same. Specified premium material, installed lower-cost material, difference charged to the client as if it had been premium. I asked him in how many of the 12 projects we had worked on together this had occurred. He told me 4. For projects. For clients who had paid for materials they had not received. For homes that could have problems similar to Fernanda's or different depending on which materials have been substituted. In 4 projects with my signature where I had recommended Felipe without knowing what he was doing. What I did in the following hours was what corresponded to be done before anything else. I called my attorney. His name was Marcos, and he had been handling the legal aspects of my practice for years. I described what I had found. He told me the situation had 2 distinct dimensions that needed to be handled separately. The first was Felipe's responsibility toward the clients affected by the breach of contract, that he had charged for materials he had not installed, and that was fraud against the clients. The second was my responsibility as an architect who had recommended Felipe and who had signed the projects. That even though the fraud had been Felipe's, I had been the channel through which Felipe had reached those clients. That my responsibility was not the same as Felipe's, but was not non-existent either. That the way I handled this would determine what part of that responsibility I could mitigate. What I did over the following 2 weeks was the hardest thing of my 18 years of professional practice. I contacted the other 3 affected clients, one by one, in person when possible. I explained to them what I had discovered, with all the information I had, without minimizing what had happened, without distributing responsibility in a way that protected me instead of informing them. I told them it was Felipe who had made the substitutions. And I also told them that I was the one who had recommended him, and that in those projects my supervision had not detected the problem. That was something I had to acknowledge regardless of the fraud having been Felipe's. The reactions were different. Fernanda was the most direct. She told me she appreciated the transparency, but that she expected the correction and compensation process to be equally direct. Another client was more emotional. He told me he had felt betrayed specifically by me because I was the one who had recommended him. That it had been hard not to see it as a direct betrayal, even though he understood I had not known. That comment was the hardest to receive, because it was true in a way I could not completely refute. It had not been betrayal on my part, but the harm that person had received had arrived through a decision of mine, even though it had not been my intention. Felipe reached reparation agreements with each affected client, correction of materials at his expense, compensation for damages resulting from the situation, with supervision on my part and from an independent inspector to verify the corrections corresponded to the originally specified materials. Felipe complied, not with enthusiasm, with the resignation of someone who knows the alternatives were worse. I never worked with Felipe again. That was a conclusion that required no deliberation. What did require deliberation was how to change my work processes going forward. What I implemented was concrete. Materials verification on site at critical stages of the construction process. Not only at the end, at the moment of material delivery and at the moment of installation of systems that have significant structural or performance impact. Documentary photography of materials before being covered by finishes. Contracts with contractors that specify that any material substitution requires written approval from the architect and the client before proceeding. Those controls had not existed before because I had substituted trust in the relationship for the verification that corresponded. That was what had created the space where the problem had occurred. What I want to take from this story has parts for people in different positions. For architects, engineers, and any professional who recommends third parties to their clients. Your recommendation has your name. When something goes wrong in the work of someone you recommended, the client has the right to ask you about it. Not because you are responsible for another person's fraud, but because your recommendation was part of the process that led that client to that person. That does not mean you cannot recommend anyone. It means the recommendations you make have to come with the controls that protect whoever receives them. For clients of any construction or renovation project, You have the right to see the receipts for the materials installed in your project, not as distrust of the architect or contractor, as part of the information that corresponds to someone who is paying for specific materials. Asking for that documentation is not being difficult. It is exercising the right to know that what you paid for is what you received. And for everyone, trust accumulated in a working relationship does not substitute the verification that work requires. That someone performed well 10 times does not guarantee the 11th. That is not cynicism. It is the structure that protects everyone, including the person you trust. If this story impacted you, comment. When you hire construction or renovation services, do you ask for documentation of the materials installed, or do you trust that what the contract describes is what is installed? Like if you believe professionals who recommend third parties to their clients have a specific responsibility to verify the quality of those people's work. Subscribe for more real stories. Share with someone who is in the process of construction or renovation and who might benefit from knowing they have the right to request materials documentation. Practical tip: if you have a construction or renovation project underway, ask that the contract with the contractor specifies that any material substitution requires your written approval before proceeding. Ask for purchase receipts for the main materials installed, and request photographs of materials before being covered by finishes. That documentation does not require technical expertise to understand. It requires existing, so it can be used if something goes wrong.